from the 92nd District as our speaker today. John and I go way back to the summer of 92.
91.
91.
You think it's 92. I think it was 91, but I know it seemed like it was forever.
I know.
The summer of misery just went on, kept going on and on and on.
It was the summer of mercy, if you might
Misery.
remember. And we had a local group called Voices for Choice, and it was made up of about 12 organizations in Wichita that were very pro-choice. I happened to be representing the YWCA, and John was a young lawyer that was in there helping our cause. So, and he's my representative, so lucky me, right. But John is the ranking minority member of the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules and Regulations. He also serves on the Joint Committee of Corrections and Juvenile Justice Oversight. He serves on the Special Committee on Foreign Trade and Regulatory Sandboxes, and I hope you'll explain what that is.
Yeah.
He serves on the Energy, Utilities, and Telecommunications, Corrections and Juvenile Justice, and the Judiciary Committee. You probably have seen him frequently on Kansas Week because he lives close to KPTS, or at least he used to, so he could fill in as a sub when, you know, there was an emergency. So John, welcome, the floor is yours.
I understand this is going to be archived, and is it going out live?
No,
So the lady in Madison is not getting to see me
no,
live at
No.
this moment.
she'll have to go to YouTube.
Can I say hello to Madison? The Madison Telephone Company is one of the telephone companies that could be in real serious problems within the next year or so because of some FCC rules that have to do with 911, and quite frankly, they don't have the equipment in their switching center there to move into this new world. So, hello Madison, I'm well aware of where you're at. There's some serious issues there. If we want to talk about where we're going, it's probably a good idea if we talk about where we've been. And as Mary says, a lot of us met each other, I think, probably during and because an organization called Operation Rescue came to town in 1991 and decided they'd close clinics for 2 weeks, and then they stayed for 2 years. And those of us who were out there seemingly every day, and sometimes it was every day, I can remember telling people who were trying to prevent people from getting into abortion clinics that what you need to do is you need to involve in politics. You need to be a part of the process. If you don't like the Constitution, then you need to elect people to change the Constitution. But you don't interfere with other people's constitutional rights on the street corner. People are entitled to go see their doctors. This is a legal activity. It's an important part of women's health care. And no matter what your individual religious or moral beliefs might be, it doesn't trump other people's rights of the Constitution. And the truth of the matter is, that's exactly what they did. You know, some people thought that Roe versus Wade was inviolate, that it was the law of the land. I mean, I grew up at a time when in fact it was. The decision was fresh off the press, the ink wasn't even dry. And so during my adolescence and high school, college, early career, you know, we all thought that was a protected right. It was part of a right to privacy. Now we call it a right to bodily autonomy. But the fact of the matter is, we ought to look at this and realize that we can lose rights too. And we have. I mean, not only because of the change, the abdication, if you will, of Roe versus Wade, but we've also found ourselves in a circumstance where constraints on the government in terms of our own personal lives have been restricted time and time again. being whittled away bit by bit. And now with the Roe decision gone, what guarantees our freedom in this state is the right to bodily autonomy. And we fought pretty darn hard, a lot of us did, 4 years ago, and we were successful. That's a good sign. Thank you for practice. It's a good sign. And that right to bodily autonomy, it's more than just abortion. Fact of the matter is that right to bodily autonomy is probably something some of the people who despise Roe versus Wade, if they thought about it for a minute or two, would think is a really good idea. If you don't like the government telling you to take vaccines, then maybe the right to bodily autonomy in Kansas would say you don't have to. The right to bodily autonomy extends to a lot more things than just reproductive rights. The right for me to be me and you to be you. And if you're gay, or if you're straight, or if you're trans, or if you're non-binary, or if you just don't care, you've got a right to be you, and that's what the right to bodily autonomy is about. Now let's make no doubt about it, that the upcoming constitutional amendment in August of 26 is not about returning power to the people, and it's not about populism, and it's not really about participation. What it's about is a redo of the election that they lost 2 years ago. That's what this is. And just because the name of the issue is different, or the method of accomplishing their objective may be different, it doesn't mean in the end that the effect and the impact won't be the same. The impact will be that we won't have a right to terminate pregnancies in Kansas, because we know that when we put judicial positions up for popular election, popular vote, number one, there's a whole lot of good lawyers that, given the circumstance today in Kansas and nationally, that would say, why in the world would I want to be a judge? Why would you want, not only for the issues that we're concerned about, but the fact is, being a judge can also just be days and days and days of doing preliminary hearings and arraignments and pro forma things that are not they're important to the individual in front of you, but they're not terribly intellectually challenging. So if you're a lawyer and you're good at your trade and you want to do things, you might want to look for something else to do than aspire to be a judge. And that's as it stands today. Who in their right mind would want to leave a successful law practice and be appointed, elected, elevated to the Kansas Supreme Court, only to know that you will then stand for election, or you will originally arrive there under a partisan political system, that you have to declare that you're a Republican or you're a Democrat, and then you run for judge to support the party's platform? That's not what judges do. Judges don't support, in my opinion, political parties' platforms. Their job is to blind themselves to the extraneous factors in the world and decide cases based upon the facts and the law. And increasingly, activist conservative judges have decided that their job is also to rewrite the law. And that's what's happening over and over again. You look at the issues that we have here, what you all are about. Every one of those issues are issues that are of concern to me and my colleagues. Any one of these things going away can dramatically affect other people's lives, can dramatically affect our society. Now, we just heard about what the League of Women Voters is doing, and although voting rights isn't specifically on here, if you look at the past to see what the future may bring, we have accomplished in the legislature, over gubernatorial vetoes, we have accomplished a limitation of the right to vote. We have made it harder and progressively harder for people to vote. Now, why is that? Well, I think part of the reason for that is we can look at what happened in Kansas with Kathleen Sebelius' second election as our governor. We ran a very aggressive get out the vote campaign, a very aggressive sign people up who haven't voted before, not only to vote, not only to register, but as importantly, people to register but just don't vote. Sign them up for advanced ballots. Sign them up so that they can vote by mail. Provide many opportunities for them to vote during the days preceding the election. Make voting easy, because it's supposed to be easy. But what has happened is, people in the more conservative wing of politics looked at the results that came in after that election and they realized, oh my goodness, lots and lots of Democrats who haven't voted before are voting. We can't have that. There must be something wrong with our elections. What we've got to do is we've got to secure our elections by doing away with any voting that occurs anywhere other between 7 a.m. in the morning and 7 p.m. in the evening on election day. And by the way, if you don't have time to count all the votes that night, whenever it gets to be midnight, you just report the votes that you counted and everybody else is just too late. Well, that is designed to make it hard for people who have jobs and businesses to vote. People who have kids to raise, makes it hard for them to vote. People who don't have enough money to keep food on the table, if they even have a table, make it harder for them to vote. And so the result of that is, even though Scott Schwab says we have free and fair elections and secure elections in Kansas, and he's a conservative Republican Secretary of State, even though he says everything is safe in Kansas, the legislature continued to whittle away at these rights. And they're going to continue to do that. And let's just be honest. What's ahead in the next legislative sessions, and it's probably going to be 3 legislative sessions ahead within the next year. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But what's going to happen, I think, is that we're going to see more and more of the same type of legislation that we've seen over the past 3 years, and particularly last year. The supermajority, and I'm going to talk principally about the House because that's where I work, but the supermajority there, as you know, the last election actually expanded. We were down 3 votes, now we're down 5 votes to support the governor's veto. And so the bottom line of that is they can run just about any cockamamie crazy idea that they've seen on whatever podcast they watch. They go down, they turn it into a bill, and the next thing you know, it becomes law. There's nothing, honestly, that at this point, the people on the progressive side of the aisle can do to stop a lot of those really bad ideas. Let me give you an example of one that's coming up. I don't want to quote Dire Straits because the song has some sexist connotations to it too, but it starts out talking about money for nothing. Well, Blake Carpenter, our Speaker Pro Tem of the House, has just announced that he's going to be submitting a constitutional amendment that's money for nothing. He says that we can do away with our property taxes completely in Kansas, completely, and we'll form a sovereign wealth fund. Now, if you've heard about a sovereign wealth fund, it may have been because you occasionally see advertisements from Abu Dhabi, Saudi Arabia, and other countries, principally with large oil resources, who have formed so-called sovereign wealth funds. They say, we've got a lot of money in the ground, so to speak, and we'll go ahead and pledge that money as collateral. We'll leave our oil in the ground, we'll borrow the money, and then we'll go out and we'll invest in all types of international businesses and so on. We'll then generate revenue, and that revenue from our sovereign wealth fund will pay for running the government, bringing the fire engines to your house, paving the streets. Blake thinks that somehow we could form a sovereign wealth fund. The capital investment that would be necessary to fund a sovereign wealth fund is far in excess of even a yearly budget of Kansas. You're going to have to somehow have maybe a 10 years worth of the entire budget of the state somewhere in something that's collateralized. And I hope he's not planning to mortgage Memorial Stadium at my beloved KU. But the concept, the overall idea is that we'll just have this pool of money, we'll invest it, and we won't have to pay any property taxes. Now, property tax has been a big issue, obviously, and continues to be a big issue. My Republican friends, in my opinion, are responsible for the mess. I really believe they are responsible for the mess. The first thing they did was they set out to gut the income tax, particularly as it relates to capital gains, long-term business investments, and in particular handing out tax credits for anything and everything which spend like dollars at the bottom of the tax return. Instead of sending in money to pay your taxes, you just reach into your drawer and you have these tax credits because you've done things that the legislature wanted you to do that they thought were a good idea, and you send in your tax credits. Or even if you don't need your tax credits, you sell them on the open market at auction, and they bring about 80 to 90% of their face value, and you pocket the money. But as a result, we've decreased the tax rate for the most wealthy Kansans, and we've kept, or even to some extent increased, the income tax rate for those of us who don't make that much money. They liked that. They thought that was a great idea. Now the issue is property taxes. People living on fixed income can't afford 2 to 3 times the property tax on their house that was the tax when they purchased it. I'm paying 2 to 3 times as much in property taxes as I paid on a house that I bought in 2000, 25 years ago. That house is also worth 2 to 3 times more than it was, and the cost of bringing the firefighter to my door, or the ambulance, or the police officer, all of those things have probably at least doubled in the last 25 years. Eggs aren't getting cheaper, electricity isn't getting cheaper, and providing needed public services is not getting cheaper either. But what my Republican colleagues did was they said, well, we're going to provide some property tax relief. They did away with what amounts to about $38 worth of property taxes on a $150,000 house, and that was from a levy that was going to the state of Kansas. Now, property taxes go to state and local governments, and they go to fund schools. They don't fund the general operations of the state anymore. So, if you lower or get rid of income taxes, you get rid of property taxes. Either you form a phony sovereign wealth fund to write IOUs and bad checks, or you dramatically cut services. You bring us back to a world where, you know, at one time in Kansas, you had to buy a membership in a fire department to get your house fire put out. And by the way, if your neighbor's house was on fire and they didn't have a membership, then their house caught fire and burned theirs down too. And we kind of figured out it might be better to have universal fire service. Is it really any different with healthcare?
No.
No, it's not. I really don't think it is. And when you talk about vaccines and this craziness that's going on, it says don't take Tylenol because somebody in some study, small study, 2 of them, said they think there may be a relationship between Tylenol and autism spectrum disorder. It's insane. I'm sorry, it's insane. But the point that I want to make is that when it comes to healthcare, we're all in this together as well. You know, if a pandemic tears through the community like COVID did, and how soon we forget. 8,000 Kansans are dead, by the way, and probably twice as many have succumbed thereafter to something related to it. But if it races through the community, it doesn't just take out the people with insurance or the people without insurance. We all die. And we're not ready for that. Now, how does that relate to what's coming up in the Kansas legislature? We're going to see a lot more attempts to pass really bad radical ideas. They have the votes to do it. They have the members who are willing to toe the party line to do it. I'll tell you, there are Republican members of the Kansas legislature. A lot of these folks are my friends. I tell people, if I have a flat tire or car trouble in the middle of the night, I'm not going to call one of my Democratic friends. I'm going to call one of my Republican buddies. They got a pickup truck and a wrench. I mean, come on. Some of them, that's about all they know is pickup trucks and wrenches, but you know, that's who I'm going to call. But they are under tremendous pressure from their leadership. Okay? There was a time when you could not always support the Speaker in the House, at least, or for that matter, the President in the Senate, and you could get away with it. The leadership would give you a few votes. A hard vote would say, yeah, you vote your constituents today. That doesn't happen anymore. I can give you example after example, but the one that comes immediately to my mind is the House Energy Committee, where I've been there for 12 years. We had a chairman of the committee that, whether he should or shouldn't have been the chairman, I mean, his qualifications were that he had worked for Southwestern Bell Telephone Company as a telephone repair person. And so when they lost the petroleum geologist as the chair of the Energy Committee, they put the man from the telephone company in the job. Meanwhile, Evergy, their lobbyist, retired. He went to the legislature. He's now on the committee. But, by the way, he's also our friend Mark Schreiber, who votes with us a lot of the time, one of the very few. But the point of my story is that the chair of the committee had the temerity to sign on to a letter saying Evergy is charging too much. We need to slow down rate increases. And he was immediately fired as the chair of the committee, taken off the committee. He's no longer on the committee. And all of that was just retribution for him signing on a letter as the chair of the committee saying we need to do things to control rate increases. There are example after example after example of that. There is a price that is paid by any member of the majority party who votes with the minority. And that price, either it's exacted immediately by firing somebody the next day from their committee assignments, taking away their reason for being in the legislature, or at the next election they're primaried and they get beat. And that serves as a strong lesson to anybody else who would dare to cross party leadership. We'll take away what you have now, and we'll beat you in the next election. So, I don't think that we're going to see good things in the legislature. But what we ought to talk about that is important, obviously coming up, is a possibility of a special session. I'm sure I don't need to tell you all about what's going on with redistricting congressional races. I mean, it's as plain as the nose on your face, what's going on. The United States Supreme Court at least inferred that political gerrymandering of the congressional districts is not a violation of the Constitution or Voting Rights Act. And as a result, since our last reapportionment, which was for 22, following the 2020 census, the rules have changed. At that time, my colleagues, particularly my Republican colleagues, thought that they couldn't call a political gerrymander because that might be violating the Constitution. So they had to come up with other ways to justify doing the exact same thing. Now, with the Supreme Court's ruling, they believe that they can say, yes, we're doing this for political reasons. This will strengthen our political power. And we've got this one Democratic senator in Kansas, Sharice Davids, up there in northeast Kansas, where all those liberals live up there. What they call them, dark evil places like Lawrence. You may remember that. So what they've decided is we've got to exterminate, and I don't mean exterminate's a bad word in today's politically in the career of Sharice Davids, because we can't have any blue people in Washington from Kansas. This is a red state. In order to do that, they're going to need to call a special session, okay? And presuming whatever they turn out of that special session is vetoed by Governor Kelly, which I can bet you dollars to donuts is exactly what would happen, then they're going to have to come back and do another special session within the 30 days that they have after a veto to override the veto. If you've been reading the Kansas Reflector, as I do, there's an excellent story by Tim Carpenter. And there's also in the Sunflower State Journal, which is a subscription service, some really good articles by Brad Cooper there. And there's a really good article in the Handbasket, I think. Am I getting that right? There's the Handbasket, the Punch Bowl, I can't remember. It's written by clearly a female blogger who occasionally comments on Kansas races. But what they've got to do is they've got to get both houses to have 2/3 of the members sign a petition saying we want a special session. That means 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate. And that's assuming the governor won't call one. And the governor's not going to call a special session for this. But that means that in the House where they've got, I write this down, in the House where right now they've got 88 votes and they only need 84 to override the governor, the chances, they've got to go find those 2/3. They've got to get to that magic number of 84 votes to override the governor or to call a special session. Clearly the Senate, they have the votes to do that. Ty Masterson has made it clear they have the votes to do that. The House, Dan Hawkins, the Speaker, has been much more closed-mouthed about this and has in fact even displayed some reluctance perhaps to move quickly. That's happening, I think, principally because he has members in Johnson County who only won their election by just a few votes. And I don't want to point the finger at them and shine the bright light on them because that'll remind Dan Hawkins, they need to do something to them. But those folks have to be very careful because if they take more votes that upset their electorate and are contrary with what their constituents desire, the end result will be that it'll be much harder for them to get reelected, and they're going to be looking at getting reelected in the same election cycle as the constitutional amendment is on the ballot. Constitutional amendment that we've already defeated. Just a new amendment, different words. And redistricting could be a serious issue. So you have several of these folks who are saying, I'm not sure that I want a special session. On the other hand, President Trump called the Republican legislators from Kansas to Washington a week or two ago. And I don't think he met with them, but he summoned them all into the executive office building. And I'm sure they got a lecture on how to cali cabbage. And they got their marching orders from the president. And they know if they don't do what the president wants, which i.e. would be hold a special session and redistrict Kansas, hold another special session to overcome the veto, that if they don't do those things, that they're going to be looking at somebody running against them in a primary in that same election that we're going to be voting on the constitutional amendment to select judges. It takes a lot of fortitude and a lot of courage to say, no, Mr. President, I'm not going to follow your advice. You go ahead and primary me. You go ahead and endorse my opponent. You make my life miserable and maybe sick the Justice Department on me before we're done. It takes a lot of courage, and I don't think I don't think that we have colleagues in the Republican Party that are going to stand up to that. Mark Schreiber's announced that he's not going to do that. Not going to go along. But in the end, I think they're going to get their votes. Now, there are other people who say no, there are far too many procedural hurdles. They won't get the petition done. So people will sign the petition, and on the day the session occurs, they'll come down sick, or they'll have a funeral, or they won't show up. By the way, people who don't show up for votes like that are basically counted as a no vote. That's the way it works. You have to reach the number, 2/3, in order to pass it. People who aren't there, 2/3 of the entire House, whether they're there or not. So anybody who doesn't show up, it's just like a no vote. So there'll be people maybe who try to avoid these things by coming down sick, going to a funeral, all those sort of things. Or there may be people who go to one vote but not the other, meaning that when it comes time for the override vote of what Governor Kelly will probably do, maybe they just don't show up. Then we've also got the Derek Schmidt factor. And you need to think about how the Derek Schmidt factor works into this. Those blue precincts that are full of Democrats that elect Sharice Davids, they're all up in northeast Kansas. They're generally the downtown Wyandotte County, Kansas City area, and parts of Johnson County. So when we redistricted the last time around, they thought they could get Sharice. They thought that they could reach down a little bit south into Johnson County and find some more Republican precincts down there, give them to Sharice Davids, and maybe get enough votes to beat her. Actually, she increased her margin of victory. Yeah. Isn't that neat? She increased her margin of victory. A lot of people will tell you that the only way they can truly accomplish their aims is to put Kansas City, Kansas in 3 different congressional districts in order to dilute those Democratic votes into a bigger pool and thereby eliminate any Democrat from northeast Kansas. But if you looked at how the maps are, the only thing that's really surrounding that Kansas City area where the 3rd district is the 2nd district, and that's Derek Schmidt territory. The only thing that you could do to dilute the existing district is to move Republicans out of Derek Schmidt's congressional district, figuratively, move them on the map, and put them over in the Kansas City district, so you'll have more Republicans over in the Kansas City district, and therefore you won't elect another Democrat. But the problem is, Derek's not entirely safe. If you take too many Republican votes away from Derek Schmidt, then Derek Schmidt doesn't get to go to Washington anymore.
Good.
Yeah. The other thing that happens, and could happen in this circumstance, is that they look for more Republicans by reaching more into quote-unquote affluent areas of Johnson County and move those folks into the 3rd district. There's still some people in Johnson County who are 2nd district voters. You move them into the 3rd district to get yourself more Republicans over there, but the problem is those are the very precincts that are becoming more and more blue with each passing election. We have made gains as Democrats up in the metro Kansas City area in Johnson County because people like Stephanie Sawyer Clayton, who started out as a Republican, saw the light, realized what these folks are doing, and she couldn't support it, and she became a Republican. And now she carries that district, which was known as a Republican district when she was first elected. She carries it handily and easily. And that could happen more and more. And so you've got people who've said, I'm not sure if I want to go through with this redistricting because it may cause me problems at home. So, do we know for sure what's going to happen? No, we don't know for sure what's going to happen. But my bet is that Republican leadership in the House, with the assistance of the President, will coerce the necessary signatures to get the special session. But then I think that's when the rubber will meet the road, because then Derek Schmidt's going to have to defend his seat with his friends. And they're going to have to mess around with trying to draw a map that makes Derek Schmidt happy and at the same time takes out Sharice Davids. And I don't know that you can do that. An example of where this happened was in Utah. A very similar situation, 4 congressional districts. And what happened there was, we're not going to go on too long. Ha ha. Love the sound of my own voice, always. Kathy can tell you how bad it is. Try Casey with Carmichael. He says the same thing over and over about 3 or 4 times, you know. But at any rate, what I think we're going to see, I don't even know what I was getting ready to say. Utah. What happened there was they had the same situation. They tried to chop up the blue district, and they ended up losing 2 seats. Yay. Because they split up the game. And so they picked up, as I recall, 2 seats. Certainly 1. It didn't work. That's the bottom line. So, what do we do? What do we do about all of this?
Elect more Democrats.
Now you know that we used to not endorse candidates in 501c3s and houses of worship, but now we can endorse candidates from the pulpit, as I understand it. I'm not going to do that, but I can tell you where I think we're going, and I think what's going to happen. We're going to see another year of just getting the tar beat out of us, quite honestly, in the legislature. If you're a moderate Republican, they're going to do their absolute best to make sure that you're never seen again. And if you are a Democrat, they're going to try to marginalize you to the point that your opinion doesn't matter. And then they're going to try to double down on the success that they've had 2 years ago, or a year ago, in the election where they picked up seats. But I don't think it's going to work. I think what we're going to see is an election that's very similar to what happened when the Bodily Autonomy Amendment was on the ballot. I think organizations like yours and a number of others are going to get the people out to vote once again. Because make no mistake about it, if abortion is your issue, abortion rights are once again on the ballot in August of 2026. You also have to remember something else happened in that election. There were 3 different constitutional amendments on that ballot. One of them was about administrative regulations. It was a complete overreach by the legislature to overturn a decision from 1982 by our Supreme Court. And by the way, when a decision takes place in 82 and you come back 4 years later to say, oh, that was wrongly decided, we need to change the law, you ought to be suspect of that. You really ought to, a decision that's lasted for 40 years and now, and it has nothing to do with abortion, but it had to do with something called legislative overreach. The third amendment was to guarantee the office of sheriffs. It didn't have anything to do with the legislature. It was the only amendment that passed. The ones that had to do with the powers of the legislature, they lost. And we're looking at the same thing coming down the pike. There are 3, 4 constitutional amendments at least, and I can't remember what all they've got on the that they've already passed, including another one about administrative regulations. You want to know what an administrative sandbox, a regulatory sandbox is? Ridiculous idea. What it says is, if you want to open a restaurant, and there's a regulation about sanitation, that you got to have hot water in your restaurant, we're going to let you declare yourself to be a regulatory sandbox. You won't have to comply with the regulation for hot water in your restaurant. You go ahead and run your restaurant with no hot water, and we'll wait and see if anybody gets sick. And then maybe when they get sick, then we'll take away your exemption from this regulation. But otherwise, If you run your restaurant for a year, nobody gets sick, then your exemption for the regulation will become permanent. That's supposed to spur innovation. Yeah, it's going to spur innovation. And if you're a toilet paper manufacturer, it's going to be a happy day for you because you're going to have a lot more sick people. So these are the kinds of crazy ideas that we're going to see. But look to the past. Look to the past. Kathleen Sebelius got elected governor, supporting women's rights, abortion rights. Mark Parkinson became governor, and he supported those same rights and causes as well back when he was a Republican, back when he was the executive director of the state Republican Party. One of the Republicans who got caught back in the Summer of Mercy and those things and got shown out the door of the party, just like Pat Ranson and Jack Ranson, and on we could go. I think what will happen is that voters will see this as legislative overreach once again. The Kansas legislature just getting too big for its britches. And I think